Okay, thank you very much. I think that takes us nicely into our third question, which is about who should define success. We're a group of think tanks and donor reps largely, and the question is basically, can we measure it, and who should define it? And to what extent do we think that the donors should set levels of expectation about think tank success over a 2, 4, 5, 10, 15-year time frame? And can you predetermine success? And if so, who should be doing that? And I'd encourage us to think not about individual think tanks, but given the challenge of sitting in a room with 49 think tanks here, how can we have enough commonality to make some sense over the whole group, not just a unique solution for every think tank? Goran, would you like to have a go?
You know, who should define success? Let me touch upon one aspect that actually to complement what you said, because some of my colleagues focus on the time horizons, and I think that's important. But another aspect that actually we forget, and it's embedded in a lot of things what we do as donors, is the level of trust. Each instrument has a different level of trust, and that's actually very important. And I find that core grant actually has a higher level of trust than a project grant. And I think that that's also very important to emphasize, because it's not only about the time that you allow it, it's also the level of freedom. I think you mentioned, but somehow we forget this. And I see that actually declining in the international environment. When I say declining, it's not only about that there is no venture capitalism. I think that there are more obstacles, partly because of the short time spans that also the donors have to think. But also partly because of various agendas. We should not forget that actually, now we think about defining success within maybe individual think tank or within an individual country, but we should not forget that most of the donors' aid comes within a particular context. The sender's country has its own polity that actually wants to see success in the receiving country. Also, the sender's country has its own foreign policy that might change over time. And actually, we live in times where those countries have dramatic changes. So actually, I really would like to see, to change even the locus of the defining of success, that it's not only anymore in the recipient country, but it's equally so in the sender country. And especially because in the Western world is going through a very challenging transition. Then, when you talk about this, I have to say, we in the think tank fund, we had a very principled decision to make. We had a limited amount of money, and we know that in order to do a lot of things, you have to address both supply and demand end. Actually, it has been like almost the chicken and the egg problem. What comes first? There is no correct answer. We agreed to say, okay, for us, it will be the supply. Because we thought when there is a window of opportunity to intervene, you have to have a high-quality research in order to be able to give it to policymakers. It doesn't mean that that's sufficient. And this is actually where, when you ask about success, there's so many things in the equation, not because it's complex, but because sometimes you cannot define all of them. And let me say one thing which is in the minds of their donors, both towards us, ourselves, colleagues, but it's in the field. We don't want to subsidize endlessly. Because sometimes it's about subsidizing. And sometimes it's, okay, we subsidize a poor government because it cannot pay. Other times, actually, you find yourself subsidizing other donors that are not ready to pay for the full product, especially as a core grant. And I have to say, when I define success, I would say I define success when on the technical side, the grants doesn't fall into this pit. And then on the general phase, you see that actually you give a sort of a value added. And again, the value added will be in the quality of policy research first, and second in the traction it makes in the society. And let me illustrate one thing, and I will stop with that, because when we talk about success, we have to also talk about failure. And for me, for example, there is a genuine failure where everything goes in a sort of a linearity. And sometimes when we focus on too many technical things, we end in the linearity. I don't have an answer to that question, but I think being aware is a first step to solving it.
Okay, thank you. I think the point you made about do core grants subsidize the meanness of other donors is a really interesting insight. So I'll take that one with me. Lewis, anything to add on onto who should define success?
Yes, I would like to also make a comment on the previous question and then lead up to this question of who determines success at the end of the day. I think if we started with a successful engagement between a donor and a think tank, it would be such a relationship which puts the think tank in the driving seat. Donors, the nose and the eyes, yes, the fingers out. I think that's, to me, a successful engagement. You don't want to get into a situation where the donors get into running the TTI and influencing the program of the TTI. So a successful engagement is one that puts the think tank in the driving seat, builds the capacity of the think tank to deliver quality work, builds the credibility of that particular think tank. So it is a relationship that helps the think tank deliver on its objective. If that is the case, then assessment is based on the objectives of the think tank. So you assess success on the basis of delivering on the objectives of the think tank. But I want to touch on the failures from my own experience at the African Development Bank. There is a tendency where the money drives the program of the think tank. The think tank starts with a work program, but donors come in with money and it drives the program of the think tank away from its own work program. I think the think tank then becomes an entity that is doing commissioned work of donors. And to me, that is a failure because the moment the money runs out, that's it. You have undelivered work program, but that's the end of the think tank also. It becomes extremely difficult getting a sustainable program. The second one is where if the think tank is not in the driving seat, where the resources of the think tank are stretched by these additional programs that are financed by donors. And we had cases where donors wanted the African Development Bank to participate in certain projects. And they would come with the resources and they would, in most cases, talk to the president. The problem that it would stretch the resources of the institution and effective collaboration would be extremely difficult. So our only contribution would be to provide an African Development Bank logo. Now, that's not, for me, effective collaboration. So the think tank must be in the driving seat. It must look at its own resources and must be able to deliver.